Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily Fringe Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Larmer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Nicholas?
I'm pretty good. We are also, of course, joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's been raining here actually, so nice and cool, and garden and trees and lawn are all very happy after
Spectacular.
a hot summer. Yeah. All good, thanks.
Indeed. And I thought winter may have arrived up in the Highveld here, but it seems not quite yet. Still might have a couple of warm days before the cold sets in. So that's nice if you like warm weather, which I don't. But then again, I don't go outside, so it's not really important to me. But anyway, our first story today is about a group that, has been making a lot of headlines recently, which is, of course, Operation Dudula. So those of us who've watched previous episodes will know that this is a group that kind of has informally appeared it started quite small in Soweto, and it seems to have grown quite prominent. It clashed with the EFF, and its stated goal is to help the government enforce immigration restrictions and the immigration laws by kind of carrying out what it seems to be sort of vigilante activities and checking on the status of foreign nationals and ensuring that foreign businesses have licenses and that kind of thing. There has been violence associated with the group. There have been clashes between the group and foreigners. And their leader, who is one of these sort of quite, eccentric appearing South African political characters. A guy who was known in the media as... Well, no, maybe not. He was known in the media as Nhlanhla Dlamini, going by the nickname Lux. But it turns out, because he had to appear in court recently in connection with charges of housebreaking after him and his supporters allegedly attacked an EFF person's house on suspicion that the EFF member was a drug dealer, which is what led to the clashes with the EFF. It turned out in the court documents that his surname's not Dlamini, it's actually Mohlauli is his surname. So that's kind of weird. The guy seems to have a couple of aliases, not least Lux, which is a strange one. But anyway, so his movement has gained quite a lot of prominence recently. And of course, we've been talking about the issue of xenophobia and concern about immigration, which has been bubbling under the surface in South Africa for quite a while now, and hasn't seen, apart from brief flare-ups of violence, hasn't seen anything that looks like organized political action. But it looks like Operation Dudula might be a change to that situation. And with that in mind, the police have issued a warning. They believe that the group, which appears to be fairly decentralized, may be spreading to KZN and to a lesser extent into Limpopo and Mpumalanga. Police management were briefing the Portfolio Committee on Police on their investigations into this group's activities. And they said the following: an issue of concern is that Dudula members are perceived by their supporters to be fulfilling the functions of state departments and local municipalities in terms of addressing the issue of illegal foreign nationals. This sets a dangerous precedent and highlights the risk of vigilante activity against foreign nationals. Foreign nationals from neighboring countries might create chats and utilize social media to mobilize and plan retaliatory attacks on all South African citizens employed and working in respective neighboring African countries if planned attacks on foreign nationals continue. The situation may also affect foreign nationals who are legitimately employed in South Africa and who are also refugees and asylum seekers. The police, in their briefing to Parliament, went on to say that they believed that if the group got a serious foothold in KZN, Mpumalanga, and Limpopo and decided to sort of go on a mass campaign of causing disruptions and possibly violence, that it would be very difficult for them to control as they don't have the resources. And based on the July riots, well, we know that the police ain't kidding when they say that they might not have the resources to do this, to look into the situation. So something to think about. One thing that I didn't realize until I read this story today, but now that I've read it, I actually remember it. Lux, the leader of Operation Dudula, actually came to prominence during the July riots. I remember a video of him standing outside, I think it was Moponya Mall in Soweto, kind of dressed in sort of military style clothing, wearing, like a bulletproof vest and with a firearm, saying, "I'm here to defend my property or the property of the community." And that's actually how he raised to prominence. So there's an interesting example here of how state failure has these kind of unexpected developments in politics that we can talk about. So, Terence, I've waffled on for a bit there, but what are your thoughts on this issue? Do you think that the police are being hysterical? I assume you think that they're probably right to say that there could be problems caused by a group like this.
If the state does not protect people or communities, or however you want to define it, something will step into the breach. It's this nature abhors a vacuum. Once again, I'm old enough, and at least for once I'm here with someone who's older than me. So I'm looking at you, Michael, to remember Pagad in the 1990s. And I remember how initially there was this flurry of bravado. We will not allow Pagad to dictate to us. Then there was a Zapiro cartoon about showing Dula Omar, who was the Minister of Justice at the time, reading, "We reject the idea," and then the next frame it shows these two guys with their headscarves. "No, change this word here, change that word there." Essentially, where the state's writ doesn't run, the warlord will. And that was true then. Pagad kind of petered out, and I think it also got involved in all sorts of things that the community was less sensitive to, or was less sympathetic towards. But we've had this coming up in various iterations. I think the only thing that perhaps differentiates this is, first of all, the background of the state losing control of the country last year. I found it cynically amusing reading President Ramaphosa's speech to the investment conference, where he says business has to know about the progress we're making in crime and whatever. I think that for many businesses, that doesn't fit easy with what their experience was less than 12 months ago. But I think that there is a huge market in South Africa across racial and political lines for someone who can enforce some sort of order. So I think the fact that he was outside Moponya Mall gives him street cred that, well, the government has sacrificed. And yeah, sadly, there is also a strong strain of xenophobia, anti-foreigner sentiment, call it what you will, that people respond to. Foreigners make a convenient target, and they also speak to another aspect of state failure, which is the inability to control borders. So you've had the government kind of throwing up its hands in despair that, unless you're a VIP, we can't really protect you, and it's all completely terrible. But be resilient and be cheerful and face disaster with a smile. Keep on laughing all the while. The satirical Goon show in the 1950s once said that the government is testing our reaction to sudden disaster, which they've been doing ever since they got elected. So yeah, this is it's this kind of topsy-turvy world, which becomes very dark and very sinister very quickly. And I think those concerns are entirely valid until we get serious about actually addressing them, rather than saying, well, it's all spin and we mustn't be so negative. Expect them to come forward, and someone will rise up in Lux's place if he is removed.
Right, and I think that's exactly it. Right. So, what's quite interesting about the way that Operation Dudula seems to operate is that rather than, the xenophobic stuff we had before was much more kind of like a pogrom, right? It was sort of these foreigners are here, killing us and raping us and stealing our jobs and whatever, and we should just go and teach them a lesson. And it would be like an outburst of violence, and then it would sort of end. But Operation Dudula here seems to be very much dressing itself in the trappings of almost like a parallel state, saying, no, we're just trying to enforce the law because the government won't do it. So someone has to do it, and it might as well be us. And
Exactly,
that, I think, is one of the reasons why they've been able to kind of be more coherent and make more of an impact in the media than previous sort of anti-foreigner groups. Michael, what do you make of all this?
Just tangentially picking up on Terence's reference to the Goon Show, there was I'm reminded of the comment made by one British Army officer of another, that he was a good man in a crisis, and his handling of every situation gave him ample opportunity to display this talent. And it's it's funny and so on. But isn't it ironic that you have the police here telling Parliament they're really worried because Lux is appearing to fulfill state functions, when in fact that's exactly how he, as Terence pointed out, how he came to prominence last July. It was he stepped in, and as Terence quite rightly says, if he wasn't there, somebody else would have, and if this arises again, somebody else will do. And it was very much the case, I think, with Pagad in the 90s. Quite an interesting sort of time in the sense that there was a kind of liberalizing, obviously, of the political situation, of policing was suddenly overnight was altered. It was no longer the kind of krachtdadig Nationale Partij armed wing, if you like, repressing the populace. So all kinds of people began to feel freer, including criminals. The police were, to some extent, emasculated by all the change going on around them, and it was difficult for them sometimes, I think, to respond in a purely in the pure sense of fighting crime, because their criminal activity, their anti-criminal activity, had been so closely associated with the now undone political situation. So Pagad's and the perception in a lot of the Cape Flats was that drug dealing and the gangsterism was somehow suddenly thriving because the lid had been lifted on them a little. The law was being rewritten. There was a sense in people's mind that everything was now opening up, and it was a kind of free for all. And their sense was that the cops weren't doing enough. That everybody in the community knew who the drug dealers were, where they were, how they were operating, and so they said, we will step in and do the job. And I think the circumstances are very similar to what we see today, where there's this complete lacuna, absence of proper administration at borders and of asylum seekers and refugees and immigration. And that feeds into the mythology of foreigners being bad and foreigners being rapacious and so on, taking our jobs. And here comes, the knight in shining armor who appears to have solutions, and he acts on them and so on. So yeah, it is a worry, but it's even more of a worry that the cops are worried. We'd feel much happier if the cops said, we see this coming, or we see the risk of this, and this is our plan. This is how we're going to do it. And one doesn't have a sense of that, really.
So the thing that always, I think the comparison with Pagad was pretty good, because we always had this. It's not the first time that we've had these kind of vigilante groups like this, and it doesn't matter where in the world it is. But when you have a vigilante group like this, or a sort of skirting the line of vigilantism, it often starts out in quite a sort of positive way. So in this case, he's defending Mapanya more from rioting and looting. That's good. Pagad definitely took out some drug dealers, probably who were causing a lot of strife in their community. But it never really ends there. There's always another chapter. And if government doesn't sort of reassert control at some point, then you're going to start having, we'll allow the foreigners who pay us money to stay, or we're going to kill this person here, and then you've essentially just created a mafia, which obviously is not going to be very good for anyone. Terence, any final thoughts on this?
No, ultimately chickens do come home to roost. This is the long-term consequence of governance and political pathologies that I don't like using the phrase. I don't like using the term that contributed to a decline. I just think it was never properly built up. We needed a reformed police service in the 1990s, and I remember some of the things that they were doing were actually quite good. I mean, trying to make those like the charge officers more welcoming, and putting pot plants at. I remember going in there to report a car accident in Newcastle, and I thought that was quite impressive. But something happened to crime intelligence, for instance. You're worried about these things. That's what you need more than anything. Corruption has gone through the roof. If indeed they are worried about this happening, are we? Is there any certainty that people will know where the keys for armories are, and whether they and where to obtain fuel for your vehicles? I mean, all the lackluster response in July last year often hinged on things like that. Like nobody knew how to get hold of the weapons, or someone was on holiday and couldn't be reached, and literally senior police officers didn't bother to phone local stations to find out what was happening. And I think that puts a particular strain on the good cops, at whatever level, that somehow they're expected to do the impossible for the ungrateful, but without the support of those who should be providing it.
Right. And that's exactly it. If government really wants to, if they're really worried about something getting out of hand here, they first need to show that they're actually doing something to enforce the borders. And then secondly, they need to make sure that they can avoid some of these, as you say, kind of fairly basic problems in the police, so that if something does happen, the police will be more useful this time, instead of people being left high and dry, which I think everyone who lived through July and whose property or shop or something was threatened or damaged probably does not want to live through again.
If I could just make one clean remark there. A couple of days ago, we chatted about Minister Patel talking about how the country is going to fall apart if we don't have more BE. Well, can you imagine a small businessman in one of those Durban townships? This guy is never going to get a BE contract. However, he probably lost all of his stock, may not be insured. The minimal conditions for conducting social intercourse are not there.
Right. The lack of BE is not the reason that he's struggling to feed his family there.
Yeah, or that he lost 200,000 rands worth of stock in one evening.
Precisely. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Now, I don't know if everyone remembers this, but it made a splash in the news a little while ago when a story came out of Tembisa saying that there was a woman, and there was a picture of her and sort of large belly, claiming that she had had 10 children in one go, decuplets, and all of them had survived, and that she was a world record holder in terms of the most children given birth to in one go. But some cracks started to appear in the story. This was initially reported by independent media. I can't remember. I think it was the Pretoria News or something like that. Yeah. So anyway, this comes out in the public. There's kind of, it's a little happy story. A lot of people share it. And then some cracks begin to emerge in the story. Firstly, no one can find the hospital at which these children are allegedly being delivered. It apparently took 2 hours to deliver the children, and then it turns out that the last world record holder took sort of 14 hours to deliver that many babies. So things start to not make sense, and over the next couple of days and weeks, the story basically crumbles into nothing. It seems like the woman, the person who was allegedly a mother in this case, she may not even have been pregnant, that she had some kind of mental issues, that the whole thing might have been some kind of hoax. And basically all of the media that reported on this originally retracted the story quite quickly, except the originators of the story, which is the independent media group owned by Iqbal Survey. And he really backed his editor there. I think it's Peter Mpedi, I think it was. And in fact, he said, no, not only is the story about the decuplets real, but in fact, there's a huge conspiracy to kind of hide them now because all of the children have been stolen and human trafficked. And so independent media, on doubling down on the story, decided then to put out a bunch of videos, which I haven't seen, but I believe they were about human trafficking in South Africa in general, and the stealing of babies. This particular series of videos has now been nominated by an international group called the International News Media Awards for the Global Media Awards under the category Best Use of Social Media as an example of best practices in a journalistic story. Now, for a story that appears to have no confirmable evidence, quite weird. And of course, SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, which very publicly condemned the original story, has issued a statement saying that they're completely shocked by this and it shouldn't be considered for any award whatsoever because this is all garbage. A very weird incident. But Michael, you worked for a very long time for independent media. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what you think about this story, how we got here, the history of this whole event?
Indeed. I mean, it's really quite a sad reflection of a lot of different things. And it fills me with no joy to see these newspapers and this whole press group sort of plunging into this pit of despairing, whatever it is. I don't even know if there's a good enough word. None comes to mind to describe just how bad it really is. But the thing that I really wanted to highlight was the real backstory here. And to me, the real backstory, and to be fair to Iqbal Survey, it goes well beyond, or it originates well before he bought the company in, I think, 2013, round about there, 2013, 2014, maybe slightly later. But all the way back to the previous owners of the independent group, Tony O'Reilly and his Dublin accountants, who bought the paper, bought the group in 1994 from essentially from Anglo American, the old Argus group. And from that point, 1994, what essentially happened in the group, which was under financial pressures. So there were all kinds of pressures that typical of all the kind of modern media throughout the world, a lot, but most of which were sort of based on the old clunking Victorian technology of printing, and they were trying to shift to the new new environment of the digital world. But in South Africa in particular, what happened from 1994 was that transformation was allowed to trump experience and skill by design under O'Reilly. It was expressly one of his intentions. We know that it earned him approving attention from the ANC. He was buddies with Nelson Mandela and had, in a sense, got permission from them to buy the group. And was not privy to all the discussions that went on, but there clearly would have been some discussion about the role of the media under democratic South Africa, run by the ANC. And who knows? But certainly from within the group, what we became very conscious of was this fairly undefined but quite expansive program of transformation, which, as is probably so typically the case, was crudely reduced to race. There was also, I think, a sense that the sort of old liberal ethos of the Argus group was considered to be hostile to the ANC, and that this wasn't a good thing, and that we were to regard the new government as in different terms, and to give them more leeway and so on. And the steady loss from that point of skill, institutional memory, and experience accumulated steadily. And by the time Survey took over, it was already bad, and he then worsened it. And the irony, I think, is that by the time he took over, the kind of attrition of skill was now chiefly among people who perhaps were not white at all, but were simply experienced and outraged. And with the loss of all that, you get these very, very bad decisions. A loss of all the checks and people who say, hang on a second, are we sure of this? We remember 10 years ago X happened. If there is no memory of 10 years ago, then that doesn't arise. And if there's this a kind of conspiracy of certainty and enthusiasm for a story, as there so often is, I think we saw it also at the Sunday Times. It's quite hard to actually put the brakes on and say, are we certain that all these things line up? Do we have the name? Have we seen the person? Has the reporter actually been to the house? You need somebody to ask those sorts of questions. You need a bigger staff, and of course the staff is smaller with the financial pressure. So it's not only a race thing or a political thing. There are all these other pressures, but it all combines, and it was made especially worse by the great loss of very senior journalists who would typically ask those questions because they grew up in the business having those questions put to them quite harshly, and having to come up with very specific answers, or face the long jump, or the high jump, or whatever it is. So that to me is what really comes out of this story. Is it's a horrific story in so many ways, but it does reflect this quite long and debilitating development in much of the media, especially independent.
No, I think it's quite depressing because, of course, without a very effective media, it's much more difficult to have a working civil society and political system. Terence, your thoughts?
Well, I remain to this day stunned that how do you just conjure 10 babies up? And I mean, there were photographs at least of the mother. I mean, yeah, it just sort of boggles my mind that this, if this was like a deep political conspiracy or something, I kind of get why you'd do it, but why about decuplets? I mean, it's really quite arbitrary. But for me, I think that this goes hand in hand also with the way that we get our news. And it does. This is one reason why I'm very torn, and I'd say quite skeptical about social media, particularly the Twitter stuff, is because I've seen so many tweets that just would make the perfect, quotable statement in an op-ed. And op-eds are mostly what I do. But then also, understand that it's probably easier to do an op-ed than to do an accurate report on a complicated issue. I can sometimes lie over something with a clever word or whatever, whereas an actual reporter wants to, needs to know sequences, names, dates, and whatever. But but to get back, so I'll see this, then I'll go and try and discover find the original text or whatever, and you see that at its most generous, it's been taken out of context. Sometimes it's just kind of been made up, or it's people taking the headline of an article as in XYZ said that. Well, no, they didn't. The journalist put that at the top. That is his or her reading. I think it goes, I think, beyond the specific problems with media. I think right the way that kids are taught to read and write now. I think we probably all are familiar with the school reading study, where you got sort of like 4 or 5 pages taken from a 1950s children's story, and you have to so where do Lars and Andreas come from? Well, it says Stockholm. So, and their teacher expects you to know Stockholm's in Sweden, for instance. Yeah, I don't know. I think that many of those sort of skills have started to slip because we don't need to read as much as we used to. Yeah, it's a brave new world, and not always an enticing one.
Yeah, I think also part of the problem, sort of strangely, is that we don't need to read as much, but there's also far more to read than there ever has been. And so we're sort of caught in this strange vortex of not being able to process a lot of information properly. I mean, going on Twitter can sometimes be a real assault on your senses, because there's just people making claims and people summarizing very complex things, very short paragraphs. And
so you're saying.
scrolling.
So you're
Right.
saying.
Right, exactly. And you're scrolling through literally sort of an infinite number of these tweets, right?
Yeah.
Because it just keeps on scrolling. And it's very difficult to just sort of have it all wash over you in a tide, and then you can't even remember where you read something. I find this all the time. I'll mention something I might have seen on Twitter, and then someone will say, oh, what's the source of that? And I'll be like, oh, actually, I have to go back and check. And then I go back and check, and sometimes I've remembered it right, but sometimes I've got it completely wrong. And it's quite debilitating sometimes. Anyway, I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to the video. Also, please go to irr.org.za and click the Join Us button if you want to support the Institute of Race Relations, which is the vast, malevolent think tank behind all of our operations here. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed, and we will see you tomorrow. Right, it's only Wednesday. We'll see you tomorrow. Cheers. Have a good one.